I got in touch with a doctor of physical therapy, Dr. Raj from 3CB Performance. Some of you are probably following him on Twitter. He's going to join us now to talk about Kristaps' injury history and if these deficiencies we're seeing from KP are a result of those. Dr. Raj, welcome to the show and thanks for joining.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So you've done on your YouTube channel, 3CB Performance, you did two pretty good videos breaking down Kristaps' two knee injuries. He tore his ACL and then he had a torn meniscus. First of all, just what impact do injuries like that have on a player's body, both short-term and possibly long-term?
Sure. So it depends, of course, on the severity of the injury. We know with an ACL, it can take 18 months to 24 months trying to get back to pre-injury levels of performance. So he's already dealing with that. And then, in the short term, with that injury, it's something where you've lost a lot of muscle mass, you've lost a lot of mental confidence. So it's going to affect you with the reacclimation period. Although I will say, before the meniscus injury, he was looking pretty good. Mm-hmm. And then he has the meniscus tear. Key thing on that is that he got a repair, which means which not everyone is eligible for. It depends on where exactly the tear is and how bad it is. And so in the short term with the repair, it takes longer because you have to actually repair the tissue and let it heal. So the knee is immobilized for longer. Mm-hmm. But then in the medium and long term, it's actually better outcomes because you still have that tissue intact.
Yeah, I remember in your video about his meniscus talking about how he was kind of fortunate because it wasn't as serious as it could have been. And you also talked about when you did a video on his torn ACL, how it would probably take him about 2 years to get back to full capacity, which is kind of exactly what we saw. Have you noticed any mental residual effects because of those injuries, or do you think it's all just physically the way it's affecting him?
With him specifically, it's hard to say. But in general, yeah, we know one of the last things to come back after an ACL injury is what we call getting over kinesiophobia, which is fear of movement or fear of re-injury. Mm-hmm. And so that's part and parcel. And then when you have another knee injury, it may just reinforce some of those things.
Yeah, and whenever you watch Kristaps play, do you see things in the way that he moves, the way that he plays that's indicative of those two injuries still affecting him?
What you see right now when I'm playing right now, to me, it's just him getting up to speed with his fitness levels. And so I can't say I've watched him enough in detail over the years to really make a judgment on whether he's being tentative or not. That's probably for someone who watches him in more detail. But what you do see is a player right now who is struggling a little bit laterally, especially. And also he's kind of conserving his movement a little bit more, which to me speaks to him trying to get back into NBA level fitness. As much as you have preparation off the court, nothing prepares you for the actual intensity, both mentally and physically, of the game.
Yeah, I think, like you said, talking about his mobility or moving laterally, I think I've noticed that too, especially on defense. He can't keep up with really many of the players that he's guarding. Do you know, how long does recovery take? We know how long it took for him to get back onto the court, but now that he's here and we see maybe these problems that he has, how long until that player is fully recovered and can be himself again?
Sure. Typically what I see after so let's say a meniscus repair for him was on the lateral outside. Typically with that, as we know, about a 3-month recovery, which is what I said in the video, and that's actually came to fruition. I would expect, another a 2.5 month period, maybe a little bit more, depending on with his injury history, for him to actually get up to speed.
Okay. And then, based on what you know of his body type, do you think, does he actually get up to speed 100% to where he was? Or do you think there's a chance that this is kind of a lingering thing that he has to watch out for the rest of his career?
He certainly has to. He certainly has to watch out for it. Especially with the ACL injury, we know that re-injury risk either of that ACL or the other ACL goes up, and
Mm-hmm.
injury risk all along the kinetic chain goes up. So after any major knee injury, you have to be more diligent and more cognizant of your strength and conditioning and loading yourself appropriately. So that's something I'm guessing he was already doing.
Oh, like as part of his recovery or right now?
Even beforehand, I mean, after the ACL, I'm assuming they were being extremely
Hmm.
diligent with him in that regard. And then when you add another insult, it just adds to that responsibility to be even more strict with your fitness levels.
Oh, okay. There was I think it was on the Ringers podcast. They were talking about players that are his height and how they tend to be injury prone. What's your take on that? Do you think that's true, that just by default he's going to have injuries because of his height, or do you think it varies from player to player?
It's hard to say. I haven't seen really the data on it to really kind of make a valid assumption on that. I think we tend to pick and choose those players who do have issues. I think the one thing I have seen is that when these taller, larger players who have more load, I mean, when you have more weight through your body, Kristaps he's not like obviously he's not like a chubby dude or anything, but he's tall, which
Mm-hmm.
adds weight, but you're adding more weight to the impact that you're making. For example, there are certain muscles on your feet that take up to 9 times your body weight. So when you add 1 pound, that's now 9 pounds of force, right? So the bigger you
Yeah.
are, it's adding more in that regard. From what I have seen, the trend I've seen is that once these big players start picking up injuries, then it can get difficult. However, like in the case of, let's say, Joel Embiid, right?
Mm-hmm.
He had injuries early on. He has now started to finally understand what it takes, the necessary steps it takes, whether it's through his own diet, whether it's through addressing his strength and conditioning to really get out of those injury cycles.
Interesting. Do you think Kristaps could form or follow a similar path?
Yeah, I think so. The only difference with Kristaps is, I mean, he suffered a much more significant injury than Joel. Joel doesn't have an ACL injury history. He has a navicular fracture, which was his major one. I think he had also had a meniscus issue, I believe. But the question with Kristaps is yeah, I mean, he just needs, honestly, he needs, for me, in my opinion, if he can get a year or two out being relatively injury free, you're gonna have certain nicks and knacks along the
Mm-hmm.
way, but avoiding those long layoffs, that's really the key because you need consistency. Those layoffs really impact your fitness, and so it becomes that roller coaster. And it's those transitional points of when you coming back from injury and you're increasing intensity. That's when you really pick up that risk of picking up another injury. So if you can just get consistent play and be relatively injury free, I do think he can.
So there's been a lot of talk about how Kristaps should play, and a lot of this is just basketball styles in general. But looking at it from your perspective, looking at his medical history and his body type, what do you think would be the best way for him to play? There's always like playing in the post versus playing on the perimeter. What do you think would be the best way for him to be effective and hopefully minimize the risk of injury?
I mean, I think if the biggest thing you're trying to do is try to avoid high risk areas, whether that's driving into the paint with multiple people there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, in the post you're getting leaned on. Yes, it's not truly high risk. When I look at high risk, it's some of those rebounding and what I call like dirty landing zones, or things of that nature. Like for
Mm-hmm.
example, his ACL tear came when he went down, when he went up, got bumped in the air, lost his balance, came down, and then he went to hyperextension with his knee. So that's what I see. But then again, it's almost like if you're constricting someone that much based off their injury, then it becomes a slippery slope, right? And then it's really that, okay, what should that person do or don't do? How much are we basing this around their injury and how effective? can they really be? I mean, from what I've seen with his playing style, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, he's far more comfortable in that face up or that perimeter spacing role, which suits him quite well when he's like the Kristaps that we know he's been in the past.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing. I know that he does like being in the post, but he is most effective when instead of like backing down a player, he faces up. And so that I think is also less, there's less impact on his body because he's just, turning around, facing up and taking a jumper basically.
He's 7'3" with a high release. He can face up anyone, and once he burns that shot above his waist, you can't really contest it.
Yeah, I think right now, like a lot of the shots that he might be missing, it goes back to what you were saying about finding that rhythm and getting comfortable with your body again. I think the biggest concern for me is him on defense because like you said, he is slow laterally, and that has a really negative impact on their pick and roll defense. And I think that's probably the biggest question for Mavs fans is he ever going to get back there? Is he always going to be this slow, or will he continue to progress and get back to where he's still effective on defense?
So the thing about defense, it's far more reactionary. There's still, of course, anticipation aspects, but it's more reactionary than it is on the offensive end. And so that's where that mental aspect can come into play as well, because when you're reacting, you have to really not be thinking about your body. You have to be able to be spontaneous. And that's one of the last things that does come back after injury, that freedom of movement and being able to move spontaneously. There's a word, there's a word for it, called proprioception that can be impacted after knee injuries, which is your body's feedback to your brain about where it is in space. And so we know there's proprioceptive deficits following knee injuries. And so that can be part and parcel with him getting better as a defender and becoming more comfortable with those spontaneous reactionary movements.
That's a good point. I think I remember you maybe in one of your videos talking about how it's not just about healing physically, but I didn't realize, did you say that like our nerves have a memory, and even if mentally we feel fine, it's almost like instinct. Our body just does not want to move a certain way because the memory of that injury can affect you even if you don't realize it, even if you think you're over it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the brain essentially is imprinted with an injury, with negative experiences. And so going into a certain movement that may have caused you injury before, the brain is going to subconsciously be like, hey, don't do that. And so for the brain, it's a survival instinct because it got injured before. And so that's part of getting over that mental confidence aspect. And so, I mean, like you see a lot of individuals after injuries where they're like, I just can't do this move, or I feel really tight in this position. And that's because they're muscle guarding. Their muscles are tensing up. And that's a reactionary response from the mind-body connection, because the brain is like, hey, dude, like, we got hurt in this thing before. I don't want to go through that again.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because one of the things I notice whenever Kristaps is playing is that it looks like he's thinking too much. And that could be part of being in a new offensive scheme and, trying to find his rhythm. But I wonder if that's also part of it, of just being a little tentative with his movements and not being able to be reactionary. Like you said, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I would be surprised if he wasn't. He's been through now 2 major knee injuries, right? He's coming back. So if he's not a little tentative, that's almost like, to me, like it's something I would very, very much expect from a player in that position.
So if you had to put on pretend you're an NBA GM and what you know of his medical history and injuries, do you think it's worth it to hold on to him and ride this out? Or is there enough concern there to think maybe he's not the guy that we need? Like, worst case scenario, maybe we trade him. But just, is he like a surefire, let's hold on to and ride him out? Or is there a little bit of concern there if you're a GM making that decision?
I think there naturally has to be concern. The question is, how concerned are you? And 2 knee injuries, like we said, with larger players, we know there's a little bit more impact. The key thing for me, though, is figuring out, okay, what are his mechanics like? How is he progressing physically? But the real question as a trade aspect becomes that contract, right? Is he worth
Yeah.
the money? Is he worth that salary? And that's the question about any trade. Is the risk reward worth it with that salary, to the fact that, yeah, he does have some knee injury history?
Yeah. And I think a lot of these are just open questions. There's things that just we don't know, and it's impossible to know. Like we don't know if he is gonna get injured again. And so it is kind of like you said, that risk reward thing that they have to go through. Well, Raj, thank you so much for your time. A lot of that was super insightful. I think just the thinking about how it can affect his explosiveness, his reaction on defense, that was really helpful. I want to give you an opportunity to plug your where you're on Twitter, on the internet, so people can find you. You post so much helpful content, so please let people know where they can find you.
Sure. So it's all the same, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Just look up 3CB Performance, 3 Charlie Beta Performance, and find me, watch. I prefer comments, questions, whatever it is. The back and forth is always fun. So
awesome. And get on your YouTube channel. For everyone listening, you did 2 videos on Kristaps, his torn ACL and then the torn meniscus. I would highly recommend those. But thanks for being on. I really appreciate it. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks for having me.